So the first one is my very good colleague and friend, Associate Professor Zim Wakora, who is Associate Professor of Politics here at Deakin. And he's going to talk about, or talk to the topic of ignore, rebut, or embrace political elite responses to conspiracy theories. And reading the abstract, I see that it's about conspiracy theories during the time of Donald Trump's last presidency. So it couldn't be more timely, really, to talk about it, given the events of the last few days. So thank you, Zim. And then we'll go straight from that paper into Jessica Trisberg. I apologise if I've messed up the pronunciation there, Jessica, who's going to talk to us on a paper of Disinformation in the City Response Playbook. So a very different kind of set of questions and ideas there, but nonetheless related to much of what we're talking about today in terms of conspiracy theories, but also disinformation, how they spread in different political environments. So these are really topical and interesting papers. I think we'll give them about 15, 20 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. So hoping that the technology is on our side, Zim, you're welcome to take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you to Isan and Hasnan for organizing this event, and to everyone who's at Burwood. My apologies that I wasn't able to stay for very long. I was in there briefly. I had meetings this morning, and then I popped in, and I've had to get home because I need to do some kids pickups from school unexpectedly. So my apologies, I couldn't be around for longer, but the workshop has clearly been a terrific success. So congratulations to everyone involved. Today I'd like to talk about a paper. It's a small and in a way quite simple exercise that developed out of a book that I was reading and reviewing, and ended up convening a workshop with a colleague, Matteo Bonotti, about. And the book was this: a lot of people are saying, I don't know if you can see this, the new conspiracism and the assault on democracy. And it was basically about how conspiracism had surged during the Donald Trump presidency, and indeed during his campaign for the presidency, and what this meant for democracy. It was a really interesting book by two political theorists, Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum. Muirhead's at Dartmouth, and Rosenblum is a Harvard political theorist. And my thinking was pretty much stimulated from that. I hadn't really thought much about information, disinformation, and so on until encountering that book. And since then, I've been very interested in this set of problems, and it's kind of spawned more research, including the collaboration that Ika will speak about, which is very practical, and she's done absolutely outstanding work in leading that project. She'll have much more to say about that. But in my presentation, I just want to talk about this narrow paper, which is called Rebut rather than Reput, my apologies, or Embrace, Political Elite Responses to Conspiracy Theories. And obviously this was written in the world before yesterday, but I think given what happened yesterday in this brave new world that we're all entering, it's become really important to think about Donald Trump's style, and conspiracism is obviously an important part of it. Conspiracy theories are one of the trademark discursive styles that Donald Trump and people who try to ape his political style seem to use. Okay, so let's begin. What is a conspiracy theory? Conspiracism is a complex phenomenon, but it's been identified particularly with the effort to provide an unorthodox explanation of a prominent event, contradicting the official or immediately obvious explanation. Conspiracy theories often highlight secret scheming by individuals. They aim for a kind of proportionality between events and their causes, and they therefore reject what seem like trivial or minor causes of large events. This is why, for example, conspiracists suspect that a lone gunman could not have assassinated John F. Kennedy. That just seems disproportionate to the actual event. Conspiracy theories are old, but they do seem to be thriving in contemporary politics. In the United States, there are many examples associated with Donald Trump, the most egregious being the big lie conspiracy theory. That's the idea that his opponents cheated in the 2020 presidential election, despite the voluminous contrary evidence. But of course, there are many more Donald Trump conspiracies as detailed by Muirhead and Rosenblum, and we've seen many more since they wrote their book in this most recent campaign. So this is a serious issue, a growing issue in American politics. Closer to home here in Australia, the recent Indigenous voice referendum was marred by, for example, the baseless allegation that a successful yes vote would lead to land grabs by the United Nations. So while there's nothing particularly new about conspiracy theories in general, we do know that the contemporary environment, including the rise of social media, loss of faith in political elites, and so-called knowledge authorities, such as the mainstream media, have exacerbated this challenge of how to deal with conspiracy theories, and more precisely, the conspiracy theories that pose a challenge to reasoned discourse, which is essential for good governance and democracy. So that's kind of, if you like, the background. So how do we tackle those conspiracy theories that are harmful? Not all of them are harmful, but they can and often are. And what can we do in those circumstances? Well, the research on this topic has mostly focused on what new laws and institutions should be created. And that's what I learned when reading around this topic as a relative newcomer a couple of years ago. And what I was interested to discover, and what I discovered was kind of absent, was an approach that was discursive. So how can politicians, through their speech, listening, and writing, actually engage conspiracy theories in a productive way, in a way that advances democratic values? Couldn't find much by the way of guidelines here, and that's what this paper attempts to address, this gap. And I think it's an important gap because there are real limitations in trying to focus squarely on laws and institutions, which is, if you like, the default approach, and underexploited potential in trying to identify the elements and strategies of discourse that can be useful for this purpose. So I think there are three basic counter-conspiracy discursive strategies, and I call these ignore, rebut, and embrace. And I argue that they can each be effective when employed in the right circumstances. So I want to tell you what those strategies are. They're intuitive, and then explain to you some of the contextual considerations that influence and condition when they might be effective or not. Okay, first of all, ignore. This is, as it suggests, about suppressing a conspiracy. Speaking about a harmful conspiracy theory, even when the intention is to criticize it, may actually encourage its spread to new audiences. So it's a bit like a wildfire. You in many cases want to just deny the conspiracy theory any airing, and where possible, completely ignore it in the hope that this will strangle it, suppress it, suffocate it. A good example of the ignore strategy can be gleaned from a town hall debate in 2008 featuring Senator John McCain. This is during the US presidential election campaign of that year. One of McCain's supporters at this town hall alleged that McCain's opponent, Barack Obama, of course, was untrustworthy because, quote, unquote, he's an Arab. This conspiracy was demonstrably false, and it impugned Obama. It also was an attack on the principle of equality, political equality, because it implied that the community of Arab Americans was not to be trusted. Right? So that's an important implication of what this lady said. What did McCain do? To his credit, he seized the microphone, and that by doing that, he denied the conspiracist the opportunity to elaborate to a massive audience, millions of people, her false theory of Arab Americans and Obama's connection with them and how they're untrustworthy for a democracy and so on. And then he uttered these words, no, ma'am, he's a decent family man and citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues. And that's what this campaign's all about. So that shut down any more talk about this conspiracy, a very curt reply, which I think evidences some important things. Most importantly, his belief, McCain's belief, that the questioner had breached the standards of fair or reasonable discussion, had gone beyond the pale. And that's even in a forum like a town hall meeting that is meant to facilitate dialogue, deliberation, participation, and so on. And if we're to ask, well, what does going beyond the pale in this context really mean? There's many ways we could go about sort of theorizing that, but one useful approach, drawing on standard political theorizing, is that a conspiracy theory should be contained. In other words, it shouldn't really be discussed and debated and deliberated and so on when it challenges political equality. So that's the belief that all citizens are free and equal. And that's a principle that one can defend on Rawlsian grounds and other theoretical grounds as well. And clearly McCain's questionnaire defies this principle by suggesting that there's incompatibility between trustworthiness and being an Arab or having Arab origins. McCain, or indeed any other Democratic representative, therefore has no obligation to publicly engage with this charge. Indeed, doing so might help to sustain the conspiracy, in this case anti-Arab prejudice, fueling the fire when it should ideally be sniffed out. So that's the first strategy. Second strategy is probably should be seen as an approach that is useful whenever suffocating is ideal but not possible. And in this case, the second strategy is to directly confront the conspiracy theory with a rebuttal. And this is probably what might be regarded as the default response whenever people hear about a conspiracy theory and wonder how best to react. And some of the practical measures that have been introduced to counter conspiracy theories can be seen in this light. That is, as efforts to strengthen rebuttal, to amplify the capacity of political elites to rebut charges with facts and evidence. An example is fact checkers. These are, if you like, ways of boosting the credibility of challenges, rebuttals to a conspiracy theory. A couple of points here. This strategy will be more effective if substantial evidence can be gathered which contradicts the conspiracy theory. So you could point to the 63 lawsuits filed by Donald Trump and his allies, which effectively invalidated and disproved the big lie conspiracy. That's strong evidence. However, and as we know with that big lie conspiracy, while some people might be convinced by a rebuttal with strong evidence, that may not be enough to shift enough people, right? Especially the conspiracy's strongest adherents. And to make inroads with that particular group, we need to consider not only the evidence in a rebuttal, but also, and a lot of psychological evidence suggests this, it's key to consider who is presenting that evidence. And in particular, does that rebuttal come from a politician from the same side as the conspiracy's adherents? If so, then the rebuttal is likely to carry additional weight. So there's a particular role for co-partisans, the people who believe in a similar worldview, who hold a similar political identity to the people who are propagating the conspiracy. They have a particular responsibility from a normative standpoint in doing their work to support rational democratic debate whenever a conspiracy emerges from their side in politics. So there's particular obligations on co-partisans when it comes to the task of rebuttal. And the third strategy is embrace. And by this I mean that a politician may take on board at least some of what the conspiracy theory is telling us. And this is obviously and uncontroversially the right approach whenever a conspiracy turns out to be grounded in facts, such as the Watergate scandal, but it's also more counterintuitively possible whenever conspiracy theory is untrue. And in this scenario, a politician seeks to learn what a conspiracy theory may signal without conceding the central point that it's false. So the conspiracy theory may point to governance failures that deserve attention, or it may identify a vulnerable group that requires attention to them. An example would be Obama's attempt in 2008 to diagnose the frustrations of the American white working class. He didn't quite get that right, but he was saying, well, they believe in conspiracies because many things are going wrong in their lives, right? This was criticized as being a patronizing response, which shows the difficulty of showing empathy without conveying insult. But I think the effort and the direction of that is spot on. So this all raises the question, well, when should these different strategies be used? And I'll just fly through this quickly. There are two sets of considerations. One is institutional context, and by that I mean the laws, culture, and technology. And This matters because some strategies are more feasible in certain institutional contexts. So for example, the ignore strategy is more viable in contexts where free speech can be regulated quite aggressively, such as in Australia or Britain or Germany. But whenever you've got more strict free speech regulations and free speech can't be regulated very easily, suspicion around this, such as in the US, then ignore is more difficult to deploy because the free speech regulations can't amplify the effects of ignoring. And the second set of considerations is to do with the conspiratorial content. So what is the nature of the conspiracy theory? So does it impugn based on gender, race, religion, and so on? If so, there's a strong normative case to ignore. Does the conspiracy theory have strong associations with a particular political party? If so, I argue that there's a strong case for rebuttal, ideally by co-partisans. And if the conspiracy theory is what Muirhead and Rosenblum describe as substance-free, this is a conspiracy theory that doesn't have any grounding in reality, then really the conspiracy is telling you about the feelings of the people who believe it. In that case, you need to be thinking about approaches within the embrace strategy. Okay, so in conclusion, the resurgence of conspiracy theories is here. It's not going anywhere. We need to think about how to engage conspiracy theories intelligently, and that means more than just thinking about new laws and new institutions. We also need to think about discursive strategies, and I hope that the ignore, rebut, and embrace strategies provide a toolkit to help us begin to think through this complex challenge. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Zim. I think we're jumping straight into my presentation now, and then we're going to have a combined kind of discussion. So I'll just start by sharing my screen. Apologies. So thank you, everyone, for having me here as part of this workshop today, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me along. I've really appreciated many of the presentations that we've had until now, and I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections and any comments that you might have on this project that we've been undertaking. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people here in Naarm in Melbourne, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging on these unceded lands. So this project is a very, very applied research project. So it came out of sector need, with cities saying that they were impacted by disinformation increasingly. They did not know what to do in response. There were fragmented responses that were in place, but that they really sought some direction. And so we started a project last year called Disinformation in the City, looking specifically at what disinformation looks like in cities, how it's manifesting, how it's impacting cities. So by city, I mean the local government, city authorities, but also communities, and how disinformation is interacting with the city realm. And then also looking at how we bridge sort of knowledge fragmentation across levels of government and across sectors to better develop pathways for cities to be meaningfully involved in disinformation response locally and globally. There's a group of 5 core collaborators, obviously Zim, who you've just heard from, who's fabulously qualified in this space, as well as Helen Sullivan at ANU, Matteo Benotti at Monash, Mario Poica at VU, myself obviously at the University of Melbourne, and our civil society partner, German Marshall Fund of the United States. So the first kind of major thing that we've been putting together is this Disinformation in the City Response Playbook. So this is something that we launched at the end of August, and it was co-created with 40 co-contributors from different sectors in 3 clusters across Australasia, North America, and Europe. The reason why we did this was because there is a lot of knowledge that is held and it is not being communicated across sectors, it's not being communicated across geographies, but also we wanted to look at how we might better, I guess, apply our collective, very diverse lenses to create novel approaches in developing this playbook. So we had, we had Microsoft, we had Politico, we had City of London, we had smaller cities, we had City of Onkaparinga in South Australia, we had Storyteller, we had all sorts of different civil society organisations, media outlets, academics from different disciplines, and cities from different geographies, all coming together to try to understand and address this issue, which was a broadly acknowledged gap that cities need to be able to both understand how disinformation is impacting them, but also be part of that response. So what I've done here is I've just put some really basic charts that are actually from the playbook. You can all access the playbook online. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to go and have a look at it in more detail. But these are just a few things just to kind of, I guess, convey why we're talking about cities, that cities are impacted, how they're impacted, but also cities have agency, and cities are, they're locally embedded. So when we're looking at localized response, they can be incredibly powerful. And we've seen that in response to other really complex challenges like climate change, for example, where cities now have a really strong collective voice in the international realm, as well as locally and in multi-level governance. But also cities are relatively agile compared to other levels of government. And so the same activities that might take a really long time and be incredibly complex for a national level government department can be much more rapidly introduced in the city space, which, when we're talking about a novel and rapidly developing challenge or crisis, as some frame it, like disinformation, can be really valuable. So these 2 things are really just looking at the ways that cities are impacted. So manifestations, as you can see, everything from targeted media coverage to protests to graffiti to political lobbying to threats. These were broken down into the 5 areas that were identified as kind of common threads that disinformation often takes in cities. So health and well-being, obviously, we're in a post-pandemic environment. Gender and sexual diversity, again, being one of those societal fault lines that disinformation often follows. Climate action and sustainability, migrants, cultural and religious diversity, and urban planning. So urban planning we've put here in a sort of a broad sense, because there's also things like, the 5G conspiracy theories and all sorts of infrastructure related disinformation, but we've used those in very broad senses. And you can see that the types of manifestations with each of those does differ, that there's a lot more, say, threats and harassment around gender and sexual diversity than around climate action and sustainability. So this was something that was very interesting. Also looking at the prompts for disinformation in cities. So this was things like policy debate and adoption at the city level, but also at the state and national level. Of course, international events like, for example, the pandemic obviously influenced that as well. But as we were talking about in the previous, or as you were talking about in the previous session, the ways that international events do influence other geographies. Then there's community events and other sorts of things as well. One of the other really interesting things that the cities all responded to, and I should have said this should be considered as very much qualitative data. We had a very small sample size of the 14 cities that were actually participating in the co-creations process that were from those 3 geographies that I mentioned. But they're illustrative of the types of challenges that cities face. and their experience in responding. And certainly this is something that many other cities, since we've been conveying these findings and sharing the playbook more broadly, have shared that that's consistent with their experience as well. But in terms of the disinformation actors by thematic areas, many cities were impacted by disinformation spread by organised groups, known individuals within the community and outside the community, but also elected representatives within the community and outside. And that's one of the really challenging things when we're looking at framing disinformation response, whether it's in the city context or not, is being able to create a meaningful response that's going to that's not going to create the false dichotomy that government has a pure agenda and is then addressing disinformation, which happens externally, to really be able to recognise that disinformation has many different sources. And looking at the severity of disinformation across themes. So there were some areas where our cities were much more severely impacted. There was basically no theme that any of the cities said that they were not impacted by. And mostly it was through moderate to severe impact. And these were just sort of breaking it down into a few of the different areas. So the impact of disinformation on city communications. And I think this is really important when we're looking at some of the really interesting research that you're doing and that others are doing, looking at the types of interventions that can be used, the ways that cities are already responding and might be able to embrace some of those things, I think is a really interesting opportunity to kind of overlay the two. It was interesting that the most frequently reported impact of disinformation campaigns on cities was to increase communications. However, the second was to create sort of new communications or change communications activity. And usually the changed communications activity, although it was listed separately to decreased communications activity, actually did have a de facto impact of decreasing communications activity. There's the contested area of modifying the use of platforms and which platforms cities should be present on and not be present on and what that means. And then there was the question of disinformation and the impact on organisational well-being. So this includes elected representatives and also appointed staff within cities who are increasingly being exposed to threatening behaviour, to incivility, to all sorts of things that are driven by disinformation campaigns. And that can be everything from the level of threats and harassment that the CEO might be experiencing to the planning team on the front desk. So this was a very, very significant area of concern for many cities around the health and safety of their teams and helping their teams to understand how to work within the current information landscape, which is quite heavily polluted with disinformation. These two graphs show the targets for disinformation in cities. So the initiatives themselves were the most frequently targeted, followed by elected representatives. Then it was groups within the community, cities staff or officials, organisations, and then others. But there's a whole variety of different ways that people and groups are being targeted, specifically targeted by initiatives. And the wheel on the right just outlines some of the current disinformation response activities. So this includes, sorry, I have to change the screen setting so that I can actually read it. So community engagement, capacity building, engagement directly, so positive engagement with disinformers, training, formal responses on social media, as we know, is a very common one, or as we may know. Adoption of new policy and processes, modifying physical spaces. This is a big thing. We're talking about threatening behaviour that increasingly involves our police involvement. So, that's also a physical concern as well. Postponement of initiatives or decisions. So this is something that's a really big concern in the policy-making space. Removal of graffiti, modifying the way that council meetings and processes are run, those sorts of things. So, sorry, I'll go back. Yeah. Bringing together these 40 very different sort of contextual expert voices, the first thing that the group wanted to establish was principles for the use of the playbook. So the first of these was that trust had to be maintained. It had to be paramount through this process. Obviously, disinformation impacts trust, decreased trust impacts disinformation, and the cycle goes on. But that the entire process of responding to disinformation has to be a trustworthy process. And that this means that it cannot be campaign-based, looking at trying to replace one type of narrative with another narrative, but actually really looking at how we restore the integrity to the information landscape. Also things like non-partisanship and other sorts of things there. I won't go through all of them, but you can certainly look through the playbook if you're interested. And then the first major theme of the playbook is actually building trust. So this was something that I found interesting, that I knew it would be something obviously that would come up, but I didn't know that it would be so foregrounding in the entire conversation. And we looked at what's necessary for building trust within cities and within the local sphere. And the playbook focuses on these 4 key areas of trusted institutions, making sure that we build trust and trustworthiness of local institutions. And it has a whole variety of ways that can happen, and some examples. Building trust in trustworthy information as well. And making sure that there is a network of sharing of information between the institutions of that information, and recognizing that academic knowledge, for example, may not be trusted by everyone in the population. Academia represents an elite that can be considered as counter to the narrative of a number of communities. What is the information that's entrusted? And how can that be more trustworthy in that context? Trusted people, who's going to be trusted to deliver that information? When we have we have representative bodies that are not representative of our broader communities, who else needs to be part of that network, so that people are receiving information from those they trust? And trusted places. I know libraries have come up a few times, but libraries are a great example of this. They actually have a high level of trust, but there are others online and offline that can be used, given they experience or they enjoy a high level of trust across different parts of the community. But not everyone trusts all places equally, and it's not a fixed state. So recognizing that within city policy making and within the functions of a city. Building community was the second broad area that the group focused on. And this is broken down into creating a shared vision, reinforcing social expectations, bringing people together, and understanding and addressing fault lines. So really shifting the focus away from just addressing the disinformation to trying to address the why we buy into it. What are those things that are actually allowing us to want to listen? Because there's so much disinformation out there that we don't engage with, and recognizing particularly those fault lines that do get manipulated and that make us vulnerable as communities to listening. Communicating and listening. So the whole playbook is framed around 3 phases of disinformation response. There's preempting and early detection, spread prevention and pre-bunking, and debunking and recovery. So really wanting to lengthen the engagement and the recognition of disinformation response from just being in that post-event phase to actually being a longer continuum to better engage and more effectively build ongoing relationships. And collaboration, this was a very, very key one. The cities that were involved were asked about their current levels of collaboration and also who they thought were key future collaborators. And you can see in the graph on the left the difference. For example, with the national government, 2/3 of the cities identified that as a key future collaborator, and yet none of them are currently engaging. And this is when, in the Australian context, for example, we have until recently, we had the Strengthening Democracy Task Force. We have a number of things happening at the national level, but that subnational engagement isn't entirely, it's not connecting up. But then there's also the multi-city element, so looking at collective efficacy, the innovative capacity, the sharing learnings, multi-sector, so making sure that all of these different sectors are engaging, particularly in the city context, but also more broadly. And then there's the multi-level governance. There's a lot of things that cities do really well and contribute to this, but they don't have an intelligence apparatus. They don't have all sorts of things that exist at a national level or at other levels of government. And so not wanting to recreate those things, but actually looking at how we effectively structure and embed that collective response. And then finally, the playbook includes policy settings. So this includes things like the code of conduct and transparency that's necessary, and looking more at the regulation side of things. Also communications, so really going into quite granular detail around communications, and some of the ways that cities need to preempt flashpoints. So for example, recognizing policymaking as a likely flashpoint for disinformation campaigns, and actually building disinformation response into the policymaking process, and also things like procurement processes for infrastructure projects, all those sorts of things. Developing rapid response mechanisms, particularly based on the existing emergency response frameworks that cities are required, at least in Australia, to enact. And like I said earlier, workplace safety. So the Disinformation, the City Response Playbook, you can download from the University of Melbourne website or from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. That's been a very rapid overview, but I hope that that's been useful. And I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you both. They were really powerful and engaging presentations, and really nice capstones to the discussion we've been having all day. I'll just open the floor up for any questions, and we'll just work in the hope that you can hear us online, but let us know if you can't. Yeah.
Firstly, I've got a
Can you hear that, Ika? Can you hear the questions? You can. Okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a question for Zim. So I know, so you mentioned like there were three strategies. It was ignore, rebut, and embrace. And I know I imagine you're talking more about strategies that would be employed by, shall we say, sort of in white hat kind of operations, like government or NGOs responding to or political parties. But are you aware of any research that looks at how conspiracies are developed as a countering strategy, like counter conspiracies? Because we hear about counter narratives. And I'm just interested to know if there, because I think I would regard that as a pretty problematic kind of strategy, of course, but I imagine it must be happening. I'm just interested to know if there's any research into counter conspiracies.
Yeah, great question. I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. Some of that research is within what I describe as institutional approaches to countering conspiracies. So there's a really good paper by Sunstein and Vermeulen, which suggests even going beyond disseminating counter-conspiracies is actually infiltrating conspiratorial networks by government intelligence analysts. That's their solution to this problem. And then spreading counter-conspiracy information within those networks, right? So those are the sorts of things that people are talking about. And I know that government agencies are actively thinking of AI approaches that deal with information, disinformation online in this kind of way as well, you know, countering what other people are doing. Like, my approach is different. What I was trying to do really is think about an idealized politician and imagine that they're trying to think about how to discursively engage a conspiracy theory in ways that are consistent with the ideals of democracy. So rather than going into the gutter themselves, how best to, you know, raise the debate in a way that's still effective. Because I think one of the problems is that people think that if you're going to raise the quality of the debate, then you're necessarily going to be naive and you're going to lose. And I think that those two things aren't necessarily irreconcilable. And that's kind of the point of the exercise.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Can I ask a question for Peter? Just about the graphs you showed. So is it that you had a workshop with 14 people and then you asked them what their views were about the themes or who was spreading conspiracy? Is that a general idea, or am I missing the?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that properly. Would you mind repeating it through the microphone?
The methodology were for the surveys and the graphs, please.
Would you like to?
Methodology for the surveys, is that right?
Yes.
Do you want to just go ahead and ask it one more time and just speak up a little?
Just what methodology did you use to get the answers to the surveys, like the graphs that you showed? Just curious about how you got that data.
How I got the data. So the process for developing the playbook, we had an EOI, an open EOI that we publicized through a few kind of op-eds and things like that, and through our networks, where people could put their hand up, they could submit an expression of interest to be part of the process. From that, we selected these 14 cities. All of the cities were given a pre-survey, which was a really long survey. It was like 45 minutes to complete, so that we could then de-identify all of the data that was included in that pre-survey. And then that was provided to all 40 participants in the workshops, so that they had that as a basis for discussions. They were also given a pre-briefing pack before each of the workshops that helped them to get across kind of the different the different areas. You know, everyone had expertise in at least one area, but for the most part, not in other areas. So they had a pre-briefing pack, and then they also had the survey data. And that was sort of something that formed the basis of some of the discussions. From there, we had 3 workshops, which were 2 hours each online with all of the participants. We did have to divide some of them with the time frame, with the time zones. So we had morning and evening. And then after that, everyone, once I'd put together, they'd collated all of their content and created the draft playbook. It then went back to everyone for review. And staggeringly, they did. This was such a super engaged group. Like, people were putting track changes on there like you wouldn't believe, which I'm sure many people will have experienced processes where that is not the case. But this group was really, really generous with their contribution of knowledge. From there, we actually then sent it for peer review to other levels of government, to other media organizations, other academics, some other cities, and other city networks globally from different geographies and different sort of disciplinary areas, to actually get their input as well. So that's actually the full methodology of how we established the playbook. But in terms of those 14, it was the 14 cities that had been selected as participants throughout the entire process, and then that was part of the process for them, was to complete those surveys.
when you say 14 cities, like who's actually responding in the city? Like how many people is each city, or is it one person? Or I'm just a bit confused about what you mean by say a city is responding.
So the city is the city government. And so it's different, different cities had different people that were appointed. So for some, it was the mayor. For some, it was the CEO or the relevant director was delegated by the CEO. For some, it was a specific area. So often it might be the director of strategic communications, for example, or we had somewhere it was the director of international affairs, given that this was an international activity. So it depended within the city where they designated that to best fit.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Lydia. Yep.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for your presentation. So a bit of comments and questions, if that's okay. Tim, I really appreciate your breakdown and acknowledging sometimes embracing conspiracy theories, and especially within the U.S. context. You know, we tend to think of this as more of a modern phenomenon, but if you take a look at the broader literature on conspiracy theories in the United States context in particular, there's a lot of literature and writing around how conspiracy is actually foundational to American politics, starting from the American Revolution and moving forward. So just as a suggestion, if you haven't come across it already, maybe you probably have, but less contemporary scholars, you know, folks like Michael Barkin and Hofstadter, for example, talk a lot about the paranoid style and the conspiratorial style of America and how they are, yes, there are certain pathological elements to them, but they can actually be harnessed to have that idealized, more perfect union. And the conspiracy theories have become the vehicle in that way. So I appreciate how you spoke about embracing in addition to kind of rebutting and addressing as a duality in terms of harnessing conspiracy, you know, in more positive ways. Another person who talks a lot about that is Mark Fenster as well, around his work on America and conspiracy theories. I think something potentially to look at if you haven't come across them. And then Mika, I've been following this project. I think it's a fantastic one, and so glad that you guys are working on it, because the local government context is so important yet so important, particularly in a democratic context. And I had a good question to you in terms of the impacts of disinformation. In your conversations with local government, specifically, did people tend to bring up sovereign citizens a lot? Because in some of my conversations with local government folks, that was a massive concern for them. So this kind of intersection of disinformation and the sovereign citizen movement, I was wondering if that was something you came across as well.
Ika, do you mind if I go first? Okay, thanks. Lydia, such a fantastic set of observations and questions. I didn't catch all of it, so my apologies if my response is well, it doesn't match the quality of your question. But what I got from your question, which I was aware of, is the rich U.S. history when it comes to conspiracism. Of course, the United States was founded on a conspiracy theory, and I think, you know, the more I've thought about the exercise that I was trying to do in this paper, the more I see it as kind of part of an algorithm. And that algorithm, as its very first node, is the conspiracy fundamentally true or false? And I think the whole exercise I'm doing assumes that it's sort of false. And, you know, every so often I allude to the fact that it might be true, but really it's a story of how to respond if the conspiracy is false. And I think that should be the default assumption when dealing with conspiracies in the current context. But I think a long time ago, things were rather different. You know, democracies were less transparent. There were more reasons to doubt good faith governance and so on. And if a conspiracy is true, that is, if it's proven to be true at the time that the conspiracy is first disseminated or further down the track, then there's a whole set of other options and strategies that open up along this other node of the algorithm. And I haven't talked about those and haven't really sort of mapped those out. But I think absolutely there's a set of responses there that discursively, practically, and so on are implied once one accepts that the conspiracy is true.
or even false, even accepting if a conspiracy is false. For example, take a look at the big lie, the
Yep.
legacy, you know, clearly a false one, but there is something that conspiracy tells us about what we need to know about America and what we need to address with those systems. So even if it is false, I think what your presentation also points to, even in the falseness of it, there's something positive that can be embraced and engaged with.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think even as a conspiracy distorts, it also reveals. And that's, if you like, the essence of that third strategy, embrace. And I think we're absolutely in agreement on that point. And I think it's a lesson for people who want to take learnings from, for example, how to respond to Donald Trump and what the Democrats ought to do in response and so on. I think this is the kind of framework in which they ought to be situating some of their strategic thinking.
In terms of whether or not sovereign citizens comes up, yes, it does. Particularly, obviously, with Australian cities and my place and a few others. I mean, it's a little bit more clustered as well. So there are certain areas, like in South Australia, there seems to be a little bit of a cluster of kind of anti-smart cities and anti-tech transitions, concerns about surveillance. That has some level of sort of local nuance that's driven that. But I think one of the interesting things that cities have been sharing, even in the last sort of 6 months, is moving away from an understanding of disinformation as related to key kind of established groups that, get out there and they say, this is our platform and this is what we want, and it's, it differs from what you're doing now, and this is why, and then using disinformation as a big part of that agenda, towards things that are really speaking to those underlying tensions and fault lines within communities, but otherwise relatively unprecedented. I mean, cities are facing increased disaster response disinformation now in ways that many have not previously. We saw that with the recent hurricanes in the United States. We saw that with the recent flooding in Spain. Also, the anti-immigrant riots across the UK recently. That was speaking to underlying tensions and inflaming those. But the disinformation itself, although it did go through some organized far-right groups, was also beyond that, and used that sort of existing disinformation infrastructure to some extent there as well. So I think that's one of the big shifts that I'm seeing, is really moving away from which groups do we engage with and which are the disinformation groups, to, oh, hang on, this is an entire ecosystem and it's a way of using information that we need to be aware of. And I think that's a big shift in sort of city governance thinking.
Okay, we're going to try and use this microphone. Does that help you guys online if we use this microphone? It does. Okay, good.
Hi, this is Matthew. Just wanted to make a couple of observations about conspiratorial thinking. Because Zim, you said, conspiracies are usually untrue, but I wanted to say they sometimes have a grain of truth, which is then extrapolated on, like QAnon recycles anti-Semitic myths about a bloodthirsty group of pedophiles who secretly control the world via an unelected deep state. But powerful people like Jimmy Savile in the UK, or powerful institutions such as various religious organizations, did abuse children and get away with it. And there was an alliance, now Ihsan can correct me, but there was an alliance between political, military and criminal forces known as the Deep State, Derin Devlet in Turkey. And mainstream media is dominated by powerful corporations. So, they take those truths and then they extrapolate them. But what I really want to draw your attention to maybe is about the mindset and the style. At the root is the suspicion and doubt, right? So it's okay to be critical, that you want to create meaning, but the conspiracy mindset is hypercritical, right? It's systematic and excessive critique of all details in the statement. So that's how you can tell that somebody's a conspiracy believer, there's no room for anything but critique. And the characteristics of a conspiracy is that it appears very quickly. But if you think about actual investigations, they take years to be completed. Like, you know, if you want to get to the root of something, it takes a long time. Also, they never use the term conspiracy. They always present themselves as dissidents or anti-establishment. They're always against the official or the mainstream version, but, you know, there are differences between News Corporation or The Guardian, so they're very black and white. And, you know, this is where it gets a little bit into psychology, but they frequently mix correlation and causation. There's never a chance, there's never coincidence, there's never chaos, there's always a reason. So it does link to the psychological explanations for conspiracy, whether it's, you know, links to superstition or illusory pattern perception or whatever. So there's a lot of stuff, but I think the focus on the style, not just on the actual event or topic, but the way they express is a good way to detect whether there's a conspiratorial mindset at work. Just an observation.
Well, I can only say thank you for that. That's extremely helpful, Matthew. I think because it's quite a short paper, I was quite narrow in fleshing out the definitional properties. And I think with hindsight, I should be saying more about the associated qualities, right? Style, I think, is absolutely key. And I really like the way you elaborated on that. So thank you. That'll be very useful as I take this work forward.
Are there any other questions? Yep. Is it online? Yeah. Okay, I'll come back to you. Oh, okay, good. We have one from Ella. Yeah. Ella, if you can unmute yourself, you're welcome to. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Zim and Ika, thanks so much for your presentations. Tough gig late on a Friday afternoon when everyone's had 2 days of this, but it's been such a fantastic workshop. So thanks to the organisers as well. I have 2 comments and a question. I'll keep the comments brief. The first one, what a fantastic resource the Playbook sounds like it is. I will definitely be going to download it. Yeah, honestly, I know you were just summarising, but it sounds fantastic and really practical, as a playbook should be, and I'm looking forward to having a look at it in more detail. The other comment I wanted to make was around the fact that I picked up that you both mentioned listening, and it was so nice to see that coming through, even though it was kind of just a brief mention. I think it's something that is often overlooked, and whenever I think about listening, one of the examples that comes to mind is the empathy tent that, you know, there's a philanthropic organisation in the States that they bring this empathy tent to rallies and to, you know, various kind of political spaces where there may be conflict between opposing political groups, and they encourage people to sit down and listen to one another and act as mediators in that process. And that, to me, strikes as such a proactive strategy that aims to kind of unify and reconcile and you know, encourage collaboration between people, and as a way to kind of, I guess, heal some of that social division and work towards rebuilding trust, and probably much more effective than just dismissing or denigrating, you know, conspiracy theorists or political extremists, which is so easy to do, right? You know, but yeah, anyway, that's getting long-winded with the comment. To the question, which is for you, Zim. And it's probably really just a short one with regards to semantics. I'm interested to see how you kind of decided on the particular terms for your sort of 3 countering conspiracy strategies. So I get the kind of ignore and rebut, but I'm wondering why you chose embrace instead of engage. Just to me, they have slightly different connotations, and so I'm curious about that.
Ella, thank you for the comments. Sorry, Ika, I'm going to go first, if you don't mind, on the comment. I thought it was it's really good observation around listening. Generally, I think that in political science, political theory, we tend to be far too talk-centric, and we pay much less attention to the listening aspect of deliberation and participation and communication. So I couldn't agree more. And I think in this space, listening poses challenges. You know, how do you listen to people who are spouting conspiracy theories? How ought you to do that, and so on? I think it's an interesting set of questions. On your question about the terminology, yeah, I grappled with this for quite a while. And I think engage has a more, and I did toy with the word engage. It was definitely in the contest. But it engages a slightly, has a more confrontational connotation than what I was trying to get at there. And maybe that indicates what you think the appropriate stance should be. What I believe I was trying to get at with that third category was a posture that's truly empathetic, that seeks to understand, that seeks to get into someone else's shoes and walk around. And that's, if you like, where I think embrace is more accurate. And also, I think that I was trying to hint at the fact that through that posture, what we're trying to do is draw attention to our commonality as citizens, and really stress that we're all in this together, and we have to find ways of communicating with each other that see different worldviews, and not always as rivals, but as different. And we kind of try to find ways of reconciling diversity. And this is, if you like, all built into that idea of embrace. So that's, if you like, the logic behind it. I mean, I absolutely accept that there could be disagreement around whether that's the right term or not, but that's where I was coming from.
That answers my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ella. Anyone else in the room? Oh, yes, gentleman here.
Hi, this is Jason. Thank you very much for your presentations. They were really great. I have a question in regard to the playbook. So my first question is, was there or is there some kind of follow-up in terms of, okay, in the next 5 years, these are the milestones that we want to hit based on the playbook? And then somewhat related, the second question is, was there any kind of pickup from the government, I don't know, in terms of funding? Because it's one thing to have the playbook, and I think it's really important to have a playbook in the first place. But then I guess you want to also follow up on that and then have some milestones or some actions based on that playbook. So those were my two questions.
Yeah. So in terms of follow-up, we have got some cities that have got some funding to implement the playbook, and then we'll have the opportunity to sort of track that and see what that looks like, and also what sorts of modifications they need to make. The initial cities that are looking at doing this, that have already sort of got their structure in place, are located in 4 different European countries. And so it'll be a really interesting kind of comparative opportunity to look at how that's implemented, given that a lot of disinformation, or at least those themes, were remarkably consistent, but had kind of local flavor. I've spoken to some of the national ministries in those governments, and they're really interested in supporting that. None of them have come up with any cash yet, to your second question, but certainly, I mean, the Australian government, I've met with 4 different federal departments since this came out. Australia's represented on the G7 rapid response mechanism, who I'd already presented to just before this was released. So there's a lot of interest from the Australian national government, from other national governments as well. But the subnational connection is still a little bit unfamiliar for a lot of national governments. And so part of the work is still about really helping both cities and national governments and the states and regional governments in between to sort of understand each other and be able to create some meaningful pathways for that connection, particularly when it is highly securitized in the national level, and that can prevent local involvement in many conversations and initiatives. So yes, interest. Yes, are we going to be implementing it? We will. Our cities will, and we'll have the opportunity to then work with them to evaluate what that looks like, including what it looks like for different micro communities within cities, given that communities are targeted and impacted in different ways by disinformation, but also communities use information differently. And so what that means in terms of our relative sort of risk profile, I guess, of disinformation activities. Yeah, it's looking good.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, I love both your work. My question's specifically about the playbook and the idea of building trust, which is, I think, really critical, but also super challenging, given often it could be something that cities could influence and not control. But given so many city services are run for profit, is there anything around that? Given I sometimes see that the idea for profit and the economic model is really affecting the trust that citizens have.
Do you mean as in services within the city that have been privatized, or cities operating services for their own profit?
I think we see both occurring. Yeah, we see services privatized, rubbish collection, libraries having KPIs that have been quantified and required to run for profit, and this drive for surplus within cities.
Yeah, well, I think like if we distinguish between the two, because there are, you know, quite strict regulations on governments being allowed to operate for profit, and certainly some of their services can then help to supplement some of the other services that they provide. The privatization, I think, is a really interesting one. So I was just recently at the UN Habitat consultation with the private sector in Silicon Valley, of all places, looking at how they're going to frame their guidelines for human-centered smart cities transitions. And, you know, when we talk about smart cities, we talk about tech transitions and we talk about disinformation, all of those things have a huge role for private sector, right? And so there's sort of that constant tension between the need to positively engage and create useful opportunities for that, whether it's around service delivery, whether it's around disinformation response, you know, in the functioning of a city, but then also recognizing that private entities don't have a requirement they don't exist to operate in the public interest. They exist to make money for their shareholders. And so always making sure that that is front of mind when entering into public-private partnerships, because there's a good reason why, like, as you say, you know, distrust is driven by some of these arrangements. You know, corporate sectors are highly distrusted. I mean, politicians are also highly distrusted, but as a whole, you know, local government is more trusted than other levels. And so it's, yeah, I think it's one of the things that potentially is, does impact sort of local trust, and is certainly something that has to be engaged with in building trust. But I don't think it's the only thing. I think there's a lot of different things that have come together to impact trust in local democracy. And one of the things that I think we do forget and needs to be sort of more front of mind as we look at kind of rebuilding a new trusted, you know, way of operating, that I think it's relatively widely acknowledged now that current governance systems are not quite fit for purpose anymore, or at least in some parts. But that we need to also not just find ways of restoring trustworthiness and trust in institutions, but we also need to find ways to restore trust in people, and that governments need to also trust the people that they are serving, and that we need to have that as a frame for the way that governance operates. That ended up going in a bit of a tangent, but I hope that somewhere in there was a bit of an answer to your question. I'm sorry, it's Friday.
Sounds great.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Do we have one last question? Yep. Okay. Yeah, this time.
This is Rob. Thanks, Ika. I've got a second question for you about your project. Oh no, sorry, I haven't asked you a question yet. I'm interested in. You haven't said much about what what cities were in your study, and I can understand that because. Oh, are they? Oh, okay. Okay, so there must have been quite a difference in scale across the cities in terms of population, and I'm just wondering, through your study, were you able to get any insight into how disinformation problems or behaviours might change, might be different across cities of different sizes? Like, is there any? Because I'm interested in sort of how social systems scale. And I don't know, I just thought that, disinformation, it's a sort of network behavior. And so maybe, the idea that maybe, a city that's 10% larger than another city, is expected to have 20% more disinformation. I mean, I know you weren't collecting that data as such, but did you have any sort of insights into how that disinformation may scale, as populations grow?
I think if I can just add, scale is one component. The other one that I thought about was, the very different demographic makeup of these cities.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're enormously different places, and you're going to get different types of misinformation and disinformation projected by different communities in different places for different political purposes, and sort of aggregating that all up, through one person speaking for a whole city is a really challenging intellectual exercise that I have my brain really struggled to get through how you can meaningfully do that. But I'm interested to see, what you think about that question of scale and that question of demographic diversity in these different cities.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So in terms of the cities, first of all, most of them are listed. There are some who couldn't be listed in the playbook, but everyone who could be listed has been listed. And it included pretty diverse cities. We had Phoenix and we had Houston. So we had like traditionally blue, traditionally red, right? We had Amsterdam and Utrecht, from the Netherlands. So like very large city that has huge responsibility for its own police force, all those sorts of things, in a global city, albeit relatively small for a global city, and then a secondary city within the country. And like I said, in Australia, we had, city of Onkaparinga, which is the largest demographically in South Australia, but otherwise would barely, classify as a secondary city in most other contexts. And then we had some cities in other countries as well that had very different sorts of makeups and demographics. In terms of the scale question, like, as you said, we didn't collect data on that specifically, but the thing that did sort of emerge as very relevant to the conversation was not the size of the city, but what the city has responsibility for. So, for example, there was a big foreign interference disinformation campaign in Sweden that impacted a lot of Swedish cities several years ago around social services taking away Muslim children. Many of you might be familiar with that campaign. Cities are responsible for delivering social services. And so they were heavily involved. They were their services were heavily impacted by that, and they were heavily involved in the response. Whereas in some other places, cities don't actually provide social services. In Victoria, for example, there's only like very, very discrete areas of social services around sort of maternal and child health, if you classify that broadly within that bucket, and kind of the home and community care, some aged care, like very kind of niche parts of social services. So a similar campaign in Australia might have less impact on Australian cities just because that's actually not the services they're involved in. So it's more that sort of delineation. That said, one of the things that was remarkable was between, for example, Houston and Amsterdam, the level of similarity of disinformation campaigns that were impacting cities, because those are vastly different political contexts, from Texas to the Netherlands. And I know recently the Netherlands has become a lot more right-wing, but does still have that very strong cultural and political history around, for example, gender inclusion and particularly LGBTIQ inclusion and celebration. And yet the same sorts of disinformation narratives around anti-trans and disinformation that targeted those same communities was reported relatively equally between those. So those sorts of things were quite interesting. In terms of demography, well, that's one of the things, you know, we want to interrogate in this next phase, looking at kind of micro communities and what that means in terms of the profile of cities and how they need to understand the ways that disinformation might move, be used, but also how to respond based on the type of communities. And I don't just mean cultural communities. I mean the different micro communities more broadly, whether it's political, whether it's socioeconomic, the other ways that people congregate. I mean, in the UK, one of the, you know, examples that's often pointed to is that the micro communities of football teams are so hugely influential in people's lives, have been used in disinformation campaigns, all that sort of thing. So really understanding the makeup of cities in relation to who's within them in that regard.
Sorry, can I just ask a follow-up quickly?
Well, we're getting pretty close to time, but it can be quick.
So just, you know, on the one hand, you could argue that cities have this sort of granular connection to communities, and the networking across the globe is really useful and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, you could also say in Australia, there's already such an atomized response to disinformation, and, you know, all these different kind of parts of government sort of work, what the left hand not knowing what the right hand, you know, how does it coordinate? How do you kind of integrate with the rest? And how does it, is it going to sort of be useful in the sense of not just creating another discrete project that doesn't really, that's not connected or doesn't inform the other things that are happening in Australia? I'm just concerned about that a little bit.
Yeah, so everything that we're doing, we're integrating within existing networks or relationships. So when we do look at those global networks, we're working with C40, which is the largest or most prominent of the climate networks, with GMF cities, with, you know, Truman now has a cities network, with Euro cities. So with existing networks there, with the municipal associations in Australia to make sure that that's something that's working through their operations, and the state government level offices for local government. So the relevant ministers and their offices to make sure that it's embedded and that we're not doing something that's sort of unhelpful and off to the side from that. Like I said, with the multiple national level governments, like fragmentation is always going to happen across like complex governance ecosystems, right? But working with them and aligning what we're doing with, for example, the plans that 2 of those government departments have over the next 3 years to implement things at the national and state level. And then we are looking at how do we then reflect that at the local level with them, so that that also is something that can be sequenced. And then when they do their report and their submissions, they can actually include that as well. And when they're doing their evaluations, they can then build in the evaluations of ours. So really looking to integrate it, because I agree with you. For this to just be something that sits out, like my constant message is that disinformation response cannot be seen as some discrete thing that cities need to do as in a different thing. Like, I don't want them to appoint a chief disinformation response officer, because this has to be just a way of working that needs to be embedded throughout the organization and throughout its relationships, throughout its procurement, all those sorts of things, because it reflects the operating environment of cities, not because it's a distinct department that they can set up. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking also about the federal level in Australia, which is also doing, different things. So that's a structural issue in Australia, I suppose. Yeah.
Never leave a microphone lying around. I think is it. Okay, so So why don't we? Zim had to pop off to pick up his children, but why don't we thank Zim and Ika for a wonderful session?